everybody, welcome to the channel Phantom Era. Today we are going to be continuing our little iceberg series on the Murdered Celebrity Iceberg Explained. This is going to be part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, I recommend going to check it out because we referenced some previous killers and previous cases even in this one. To anybody that subbed, liked, or left a comment on the last video, thank you so much. It genuinely means a lot. That video got a lot more love than I expected, so thank you, thank you, thank you. And we're going to go ahead and jump right in. We're going to be starting with tier 3 because 3 comes after 2 and we're going in chronological order, and this tier consists of celebrities that were stabbed and or beaten to death. Peter Arne died August 1st, 1983 at the age of 62. Peter was brutally beaten to death by a homeless man he'd supposedly befriended. The homeless man's body was found 4 days later floating in the River Thames, and the homeless man's death was ruled a suicide. Peter was best known as a British actor who appeared in more than 50 films throughout his career. Jing-Bai died February 28, 2012 at the age of 28. Jing was stabbed to death by her billionaire husband. After successfully killing Jing, her husband then killed himself. Jing was a Chinese martial arts actress known for starring in movies such as Kung Fu Wung Chu and Three Kingdoms Resurrection of the Dragon. She was even part of the TV series Legend of Zhangji. I think I said that right. If I didn't, I do apologize. Both Jing and her husband were estranged at the time of the murder, and this was allegedly due to her affair with a fitness instructor. That and the fact that they attempted to defraud her husband of over $3 million. After Jing's death, the fitness instructor was convicted and imprisoned for fraud. No one got out of this incident scot-free. Susan Cabot died December 10th, 1986 at the age of 59. Susan's son beat her to death with a weightlifting bar. Susan was known as an American actress starring in the films The Wasp Woman and Son of Ali Baba. Susan's son spent a measly 2.5 years in jail pending his trial. Susan's son was ultimately convicted of involuntary manslaughter and served no additional time for her murder after the 2.5 years he spent in prison waiting for his trial. Bob Crane died June 29, 1978. He was found dead at the age of 49. Dead and in bed, Bob was shirtless with 2 large cuts over his left ear along with an electrical cord tied around his neck. Bob's bedroom walls were covered in blood and brain matter. This was the result of a very violent beating, the weapon of choice being a camera tripod. Bob was known as an American actor, having starred in the TV show Hogan's Heroes. A former friend was tried for his murder, but later acquitted. Christa Helm died February 12, 1977 at the age of 27. Christa was stabbed to death outside of a friend's home in West Hollywood. Christa was an aspiring actress who received parts in the movie Let's Go for Broke and later the TV show Wonder Woman. Christa kept a diary of her liaisons with several famous men with the controversial intent of writing a tell-all book. These liaisons supposedly included the following men: Warren Beatty, Jack Nicholson, Mick Jagger, Joan Namath, George Hamilton, and several others. Due to the controversial tell-all book idea, many people speculate that the book was the key motive for the murder. Despite being a popular theory, it hasn't been proven. In fact, the diary has never been recovered, and her murder remains unsolved. In many cases, the missing diary supports the theory that the murder was intentional based on her tell-all book idea. David Huffman died February 27, 1985 at the age of 39. David was stabbed to death during a fight. The fight was between himself and a 16-year-old at San Diego Park. David was an American actor who appeared in movies like Ice Castles, Firefox, and Children in the Crossfire. David's killer was sentenced to 26 years to life despite being a minor at the time of the crime. The killer's next parole hearing is in 2026, meaning he will have been imprisoned for 40 years. Danny Locken died August 21, 1977 at the age of 34. He was stabbed more than 100 times by a man he had met in a gay bar the previous night. He was an actor best known for appearing in the movie Hello, Dolly. Locken's killer was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to only 4 years in prison, which is a very small amount of time. Sal Mineo died February 12, 1976, age 37. He was stabbed to death during a robbery. Sal was an American actor best known for the movies Rebel Without a Cause as well as Exodus, both of which he was nominated for an Academy Award. Sal's killer was ultimately sentenced to 57 years to life, but was paroled after only serving 12 years. Jack Nance died December 30th, 1996 at the age of 53. Jack died of a subdermal hematoma due to blunt force trauma to the head. Jack was an actor best known for starring in cult films such as Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, and Wild at Heart. Jack had ultimately gotten into a brawl at a bar the night before his death. He left the bar complaining of a headache. He was found dead the next morning due to the beating he sustained at the bar, and the man with whom he fought was never actually identified. Ramon Navarro died October 30th, 1968 at the age of 69. Ramon was beaten to death in his home by two male prostitutes who happened to be brothers, both ages 17 and 22. Ramon Navarro was a Mexican-American actor, primarily in the silent film industry from the 1920s to the 1930s. Both of the brothers were sentenced to life in prison, but they only served less than 7 years. Jay Sebring died August 9th, 1969 at the age of 35. He was reportedly shot and stabbed to death by members of the Manson family. He was attacked at the home of actress Sharon Tate, who was also murdered along with 3 others. Jay was a notable celebrity hairstylist at the time of his death. Charles Manson and the 4 assailants who attacked Jay were eventually convicted of murder in 1971 and ultimately given the death penalty. However, their sentences were commuted to life in prison in 1972 because at this point the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was considered unconstitutional. Manson and Susan Atkins ultimately died in prison, and the other 3 murderers have remained incarcerated for over 51 years and have yet to be released on probation or anything of the sort. Sharon Tate died August 9th, 1969 at the age of 26. Sharon was stabbed to death by followers of the cult leader, Charles Manson, and she was 8 months pregnant at the time. Her caretaker's friend Stephen Parent and house guests Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojtek Frykowski were also murdered. Sharon was an actress best known for the movie Valley of the Dolls, and she was also the wife of the director Roman Polanski. Charles Manson and the 4 assailants were convicted of murder in 1971 and given the death penalty. As mentioned earlier, it eventually got commuted to a life sentence due to the U.S. Supreme Court ruling the death penalty unconstitutional. Thelma Todd died December 16, 1935 at the age of 29. Thelma was beaten to death. She was a popular actress in the 1930s and was found in her garage slumped over the wheel of her car. Her official cause of death was ruled suicide, but she had a broken nose, 2 fractured ribs, and bruising around her neck. No one was ever charged with her murder, and it remains unsolved. If you want more details on this case, I believe there is a former BuzzFeed Unsolved video out there where Shane and Ryan both discuss the case in greater detail. Despite the cause of death being ruled as suicide based on her injuries, it is very clear that she was in fact beaten to death, as they could not have been self-inflicted. Rob Knox died May 24, 2008 at the age of 18. Rob was a British actor who played Marcus Belby in the renowned Harry Potter film The Half-Blood Prince. Reports state that Knox was stabbed to death by a man who was picking a fight with his younger brother that was 17 years of age at the time. Heroically protecting his brother, Rob ultimately succumbed to his stab wounds. Carl Norman Bishop, the perpetrator of the crime, was given a sentence of life in prison for the murder. George Weber died March 20th, 2009 at the age of 47. George was a radio personality who worked for ABC Radio Network. The extent of Weber's injuries were 50 stab wounds. The murder was performed by 16-year-old John Catihis, who stated that he managed to meet Weber on a Craigslist ad. J.R. Smith died on October 5, 2002 at the age of 87. Jay was an American actor who appeared in the series Our Gang, later known as The Little Rascals. Jay was stabbed to death by Charles Wayne Crombie, a homeless man whom Jay befriended. Jay's body was ultimately found in the desert near Las Vegas, which is the area where he lived. For those who watched the first video of this series, which I highly recommend if you have not done that yet, you'll know that this is the second murder victim regarding the cast of The Little Rascals. Euronymous died August 10th, 1983 at the age of 25. Euronymous is best known as a Norwegian guitarist who belonged to the band Mayhem. Having been stabbed to death by fellow musician Varg Vikernes, a court sentenced Vikernes to 21 years in prison for the murder of his bandmate. That was Tier 3. Now we're going to move on to Tier 4, which is murder by other means such as strangulation and the likes. Lloyd Avery II died September 5th, 2005 at the age of 36. Lloyd was beaten and strangled to death by a prison cellmate. Lloyd was an actor who is best known for appearing in things like Boys in the Hood and Poetic Justice. His killer was identified as Kevin Robbie, who was a Satanist and smeared the walls of their cell with Avery's blood after murdering him. Avery's body lay undiscovered in his cell for up to 38 hours, which the corrections officers received a slap on the wrist for due to their negligence and the dereliction of their duty. Robbie confessed to the murder and remains incarcerated. And for the record, I may be a Christian, but I also know that most Satanists, basically all of them, do not smear blood of murdered victims on the walls of their prison cells. This man most likely suffered from some type of mental illness. Dominique Dunne died November 4th, 1982 at the age of 22. Dominique was strangled to death by her ex-boyfriend. Dominique was an actress best known for the movie Poltergeist, where she was the daughter of actor, writer, and TV host Dominic Dunne, and the sister of actor Griffin Dunne. Her killer served less than 4 years in prison for her murder. Jimmy Hoffa disappeared July 30th, 1975 at the age of 62. He was officially declared dead July 30th, 1982. Jimmy Hoffa was a union activist, labor leader, and president of the Teamsters. Well, he's not a celebrity by, I guess I would say, common or more modern standards. He's a well-known historical figure, and I think that he belongs on the list. Jimmy Hoffa is presumed to have been killed by members of organized crime, and his body was never found. The reason he is in Tier 3 is because his murder was undetermined, but given the fact that he was likely killed by organized crime, he most likely suffered a great deal at the hands of his killers. Karen COD died November 28th, 1963, at the age of 22. Karen was strangled to death by an unknown assailant. She was an American actress and the only daughter of talk show host and newspaper columnist Irv Capsonet. Adrienne Shelley died November 1st, 2006 at the age of 40. Adrienne was strangled to death by a construction worker in her apartment building. The construction worker pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was then sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Adrienne was best known for the movie Waitress, which she wrote, directed, and starred in. Mary Trintignant died August 1st, 2003 at the age of 41. Mary had a fractured skull and suffered a cerebral edema. She had been severely beaten by her boyfriend, French rock star Bertrand Cantat, and died 6 days later in the hospital. She was a French actress who was nominated for the César Award 5 times. She was also the daughter of César Award-winning actress Jean-Louis Trintignant. Her killer was convicted of manslaughter and only served 4 years in prison. The reason I put her death here over in the previous tier for being beaten to death is the fact that she originally survived the beating and actually ended up dying from the cerebral edema. So her cause of death was not directly the beating, but the health conditions and the suffering that resulted from the beating. Pier Paolo Pasolini died November 2nd, 1975, at the age of 53. Pier is best known as an Italian filmmaker who was killed by his driver. The driver rebuffed Pasolini's sexual advances, ultimately beating him with a wooden leg from a table before driving over him with a car. The movie Pasolini, starring Willem Dafoe, directed by Abel Ferrara, depicts the director's last day of life. Pier is included in this tier over the previous tier, as his cause of death resulted from being run over and not beaten by the wooden table leg. So similar reason to the previous case. Now we're going to go to tier 5, which is a very small tier, thankfully. So I'm going to try and go into a little bit more detail. But tier 5 is for those who were tortured, killed, and dismembered, or had extremely sadistic deaths. Christa Helm COD died March 12, 2015 at the age of 38. She and her husband were killed, dismembered, and their remains were burned in a wood stove by a handyman they had befriended. Christina was a chef best known for appearing as a contestant on the TV show Food Network Star. She and her husband had been married for less than a year at the time of her murder, and she was also 5 months pregnant when she was killed. Their killer pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was then sentenced to a minimum of 59 years in prison. Lee Miglin died May 4th, 1997 at the age of 72. Lee is best known for being a successful real estate agent, primarily known in Chicago for his philanthropy. While not an outright celebrity like many of the others on this list, he was successful enough and well known enough in the area to be considered famous, at least in my opinion. Lee's wife was also a celebrity to a certain extent, as she was on the Home Shopping Network quite frequently and created a very successful business in cosmetics. As for the circumstances of his death, Lee perished at the hands of Andrew Cunanan. This was a killer, a spree killer that I mentioned in the previous video for a previous case. If you would like to learn more about that one, head on over to the previous video. Lee ultimately died due to torture. The extent of his torture is listed as follows. It is pretty brutal, so if you would like to skip ahead maybe 30 seconds, feel free to do so. Lee was bound at the wrists, had his head wrapped with tape, and there was only a breathing space under his nostrils, which means he had 2 little areas cut out right here, and that was it. Lee had also been tortured with a saw along with a screwdriver. Reports state that his ribs were broken, he'd been beaten, stabbed, and his throat had been slashed with a gardener's bow saw. Donald Ç OD died August 26, 1969, at the age of 35. Donald was best known as a Hollywood stuntman and Hollywood director. Unfortunately, Donald Ç OD is also known for being a victim of the Manson family, like Sharon Tate. Donald's death was a particularly brutal one, involving a brutal beating with a pipe wrench, multiple stab wounds with different weapons like a knife, bayonet, and more. When Donald's remains were found, the autopsy showed that he'd suffered multiple stab wounds and chopping wounds to the chest, along with blunt force trauma to the head. The Manson family was convicted for the murder, albeit it took many years before Donald's body was ever found. Now you may be saying, well, this is just a perfect combination of being stabbed and beaten, and it should be in Tier 3. Well, that is the case. Donald was kept alive for a greater extent than some of the previous victims, and those who confessed to killing him admitted that their goal was to torture him to death. The person that is going to round out this whole iceberg is John Clay Walker. John Clay Walker died January 30th, 1985 at the age of 36. John is best known as an American journalist / aspiring novelist. In Mexico at the time, John and a friend went to a diner in Guadalajara where they accidentally walked in on a cartel meeting led by Rafael Caro Quintero. Both John and his friend were taken into a storeroom where they were tortured with ice picks and beaten. While John ultimately died of blunt force trauma to the head, the trauma was a part of the torture, and that's why I put John here. In his autopsy and in many of the articles that discuss this case, it is very clear that he was tortured to death, despite the resulting trauma to the head leading to his death. That's going to be it for this iceberg, guys. I thought it would be a little bit longer, but most of the deaths kind of reside in the suicide / gunshot victim area, thankfully. Too many people weren't tortured to death. I'm thinking about doing another iceberg, so if you want to stick around for that, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps and helps support future content, and it means the world to me. Right now, only about 6% of people who watch the channel are subbed, so if you want to help boost my numbers a little bit, please subscribe, hit that bell icon. It'll be amazing, I promise, and I will see all of you guys in the next video, whether that's an iceberg video or something else. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe out there, take care of each other, and I'll see you all in the next video.